Hello and welcome to Chapter 3, the Federal System Lecture for PA 315. I'm Dr. Kanan. And we're going to start here discussing types of government and where some of these different types and categories come from. And as we read or will read in the text, that is from Aristotle, from ancient Greece in politics. And we see the categories broken down by who's ruling and in whose interest. So a rule by one that's in the public interest, Aristotle called a monarchy. And this is what we associate now with the hereditary monarchy, a benevolent king or queen. If it's in self-interest, it's known as tyranny. And during the American Revolution, you saw a lot of the colonists who were upset with the British, saying that the monarchy had become a tyranny. If it's ruled by the few, then it's an aristocracy, as long as it's serving the public's interest, hence from Aristotle. If it's serving self-interest and not the public, it's an oligarchy. Again, this is Aristotle's definitions. Now we look at a lot of these terms, we view them a bit differently. Most of the time when we view aristocracy, we think of an oligarchy. Ruled by the many, if it's in the public interest, is called a polity. And a polity is misspelled on this graph. I apologize, it says policy. It should be polity with a T. If it's in the self-interest of the group, it's a democracy, which is what we have. So we have rule by the many, we have a representative democracy, but it's in self-interest because we use majority rule. However, that being said, we do have a lot of protections for individual liberties through the Bill of Rights and later amendments that were added. We are also a republic, which a republic would definitely reject the monarchy, aristocracy, authoritarianism, and would set up the power from the people. So federalism, we talked about in chapter 2. That's the power that's shared between the national level, federal and states, and then local government as well. And we also have at the bottom of this slide, this just goes over other nations that use a federal system of government. I won't get into that. If you're curious, when you're looking at the slides, you can check it out. They have a graph which shows the nations that use federal system of government. Obviously, many do. We have Canada and Mexico on our borders that do. So what is the source of governmental authority? In the federal system, the national government and states derive authority from the people. They both do. So the people provide the authority, of course, this is theoretical, for each state as well as the federal government. In a unitary system, local and regional governments derive authority from the national government. However, the national government derives its authority from the people. So as you see in the graph, the people give the power to the national or federal government, and the local and regional governments, their power comes from the federal government as they are subunits of that federal government. They're not separate governments. And we see this system in France and many other nations. A confederate system, which is what we had under the Articles of Confederation, is a weak national or federal government. And the people give the power to the states, and the federal government derives its power from the states. So the states give the federal government its power. The confederate system was used by the Confederacy during the Civil War, and that was to give more powers to the states and less to a federal government. National powers under the Constitution. So we have enumerated powers, and that's what's explicitly stated in the Constitution. And those powers, as they are in the articles, are to coin money, conduct foreign relations, provide for an army and navy, declare war, and collect duties and taxes. So you see right here, the enumerated powers for the federal government or national government was set up to give strength where under the Articles of Confederation there was weakness. Federal government couldn't raise money. They couldn't provide for an army and navy without money. They couldn't coin money, or they could, but other states could as well. This gave exclusive powers to the federal government. So necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause, allows for enacting laws so that the federal or national government may exercise the enumerated powers. So there's going to be many other laws that are created surrounding these enumerated powers: coin money, conduct foreign relations, declare war, collect taxes, etc. The implied powers are all of these powers together. So necessary and proper clause, elastic clause powers that aren't explicitly named in the Constitution, but may show up later in different laws and amendments, etc., but are assumed to exist due to their being necessary to implement the express power. So they may not exist yet. And of course, we discussed the supremacy clause, that the Constitution and federal law supersedes any state or local law. State powers under the Constitution are called reserved powers. So this comes from the 10th Amendment, where the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So these are not enumerated in the Constitution necessarily. They don't explicitly say states do X, Y, and Z. As we know, there's many powers that are concurrent powers under the Constitution. Concurrent means that both federal and state governments can do this, and also local governments. So one of those, of course, is to tax. We know that in California all too well. Another is to borrow money. To establish courts, you have state and federal courts. Charter banks. You have banks that are chartered by the states as well as by the federal government. And to spend money for the general welfare, much like the federal, the national, the state has that obligation as well. So here's a good graph. This is one to look at if you're wondering the differences between who does what. When you look at the slides themselves, you can, just make note of this. Some other things noted here. So collecting duties, imposts, excise, these are all taxes, revenue for the national government. Important one, regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the states, so between states and with Indian tribes. This was set forth for, these are national enumerated powers, explicit powers. Establish rules of naturalization. So a state cannot say if someone's a citizen or not. This is a national issue. Coin money, we discussed. Establish a post office. And that was one of the earlier things that we did that was very successful. Of course, we talked about declaring, conducting war, and providing for Army and Navy. And of course, make laws necessary and proper to carry out Article 1 powers. So concurrent powers, we talked about: tax, borrow money, establish courts, make and enforce laws, charter banks and corporations, spend money for the general welfare. And then state powers, or the reserve powers, in most cases are set times, places, and manner for elections, to appoint electors for the federal presidential election, ratify amendments to the US Constitution. We talked about that. 3/4 of the states have to approve of any amendment. It's just a simple majority, but 3/4 of all the states' legislatures have to have a simple majority in favor of the amendment. Take measures for public health, safety, and morals. That's kind of a very gray and wide issue. Of course, that cannot conflict with the Constitution. It has to follow the Constitution, and the Constitution also includes, and we're going to discuss this more and more this semester, or this very short semester, includes federal laws as well as the federal court rulings and Supreme Court rulings that change the law of the land through precedent. State powers, of course, exert powers the Constitution does not delegate to the national government or prohibit the states from using. That's very vague. Established local governments, that's a big part of state powers, and local governments being counties, school districts, municipalities, towns, special purpose governments, utility like IID, all of these things. And state powers are regulating commerce within a state, but not between states and not with a foreign nation. States do not have that power. Powers denied under the Constitution. No state, and this is for both the federal government and the states. So no state favoritism. So federal government can't show favoritism to one state over another. And a state cannot show favoritism for one state over another. No titles of nobility, that's state and federal. No bills of attainder. And this was kind of a nasty thing that would be done where someone, the legislature can put forth a bill saying that this person did this thing which is illegal and shall be punished, etc., and make it a law, and then the person's arrested. That is illegal at the state and federal level. And no ex post facto laws. And this is a law that makes an act illegal or increases the penalties or makes a conviction easier after the act was committed. These are just to protect people from nefarious antagonists. Interstate relations under the Constitution. We saw the change, the Supreme Court settles interstate disputes. So that was a change from before in the Articles of Confederation, where it was the Congress, and they didn't have much power. They didn't have any money. They didn't have any executive branch to enforce anything. So the Supreme Court settles interstate disputes. The full faith and credit clause. So that means, and we discussed this last time, states have to respect other states' records, judicial proceedings, contracts, etc., and extradition requests. Privileges and immunities clause. And this prevents a state from treating citizens of other states in a discriminatory manner. What's been inferred later is that this also allows for interstate travel without any issues, no problems. We're not showing our licenses or passports at the border between California and Arizona. The extradition clause, part of the full faith and credit, so provides for the extradition of a criminal to the state where they committed the crime, so you can't hide out in another state. Interstate compacts, and this is through Congress. Interstate compacts can be created where states get together, in some cases many states, or some cases just a few, and have agreements. We have issues with the driver's licenses, etc., things like that have been done, but many interstate compacts have been done, but it can only be done through the federal government allowing such compact to create. You can't just have two states creating their own without the federal component authorizing it. Local governments under the Constitution. Again, local governments refers to counties, townships, municipalities, special districts. They are not mentioned, and they have no power under the Constitution. So they are a creature of the state, is the term. And this came about under the Dillon's Rule, 1868. He was a judge, and he said that states create and give power to local governments, and can give and can take away and all of this. So local government is a creature of the state. Later, home rule allowed for local government charters that were a little more autonomy and self-governing, But again, still under the state constitution, ultimately federal constitution. So still a creature of the state and have to abide by the constitution. So you can't have a local government contradicting the constitution or a local government contradicting the state. Counties, these are geographically defined sections of a state. Depends on the state. Some states have very large counties. Usually out west, they're a bit larger. Some states have very small counties. Some states have a wide variety of different sizes. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for how they're drawn, and we could have a whole course on that. But they vary considerably. The counties, the powers vary by state and even within states. So some counties can have a lot of power and are providing a lot of the services for the communities. And in one state and in the same state, there could be counties that have very little power because there's large municipalities providing most of those services. Townships, where I'm from in Michigan, we had townships, which are geographical cut sections of counties. Think of a county as a box, and then townships, you've divided the county box into 8 smaller boxes. And those would be townships. And in some cases, townships in Michigan, they serve as kind of a municipality as far as providing services. But municipalities will be formed either within townships or within counties. So municipalities are cities or an incorporated city, town, or village. And it's either in the county or township borders, or it's both. But they have several independent governing responsibilities. And municipalities were started because as cities started to form in the United States and get larger, and you had more and more needs that had to be met, especially in densely populated areas, people felt you incorporate the city, you pay extra taxes in order to have that government take care of things like sewage and power and roads and all of the things that are necessary within a city. Counties and townships generally in the past didn't concern themselves too much with a lot of the creature comforts we're accustomed to now. They generally were more rural, and therefore people were more self-sufficient on their farm. But now counties and townships provide much of the same services that municipalities do. People have gotten used to having power and cable and sewer and water and all of those things. School districts and special districts, that's the most numerous form of government, and they're usually formed to serve a single purpose. So we talked about the school district, or IID. As you see, government entities in the United States, obviously there's the US federal government, 50 state governments. We may have more state governments soon, with the District of Columbia as well as Puerto Rico, perhaps one day. Local governments, there's many, many, many. And so you have over 3,000 counties, almost 20,000 cities, 16,000 plus townships. School districts are the most numerous of special districts, but there are 12,000 plus, and special districts are the most. And those could be utilities or IID, or there's many, many different types of, could be a city transportation or regional transportation department. There's many. So when we're talking about federalism, it's gone through stages. And we saw initially through the Articles of Confederation, we saw a confederacy in this country, which the states had the ultimate power. After the Constitution, the states had less power, and you had the federal or national government was created. But even in the beginning of the constitutional democracy that we have, many people considered the powers to be a dual federalism, meaning that you have two very powerful entities, the states and the federal government. Even though in the Constitution it is explicitly stated that the people give the power to the federal government and to the states, and the states do not give the power to the federal government, and you have the supremacy clause and all of these things, there still was a lot of fight for the power of the states over a strong central federal government. And a lot of this had to do with the tension between northern states and southern states. Um, Northern states had become to industrialize in the 19th century and the 1800s, and southern states were a plantation agricultural economy that relied on the uh, manpower provided by through slavery. And the northern states relied on manpower predominantly from immigrants coming from Europe at that time. So during this time, the back and forth between those two groups of states, you had an effort to maintain an even split between slave states and free states. And this made it contentious. And we've seen some of the things like the 3/5 compromise and these horrible things that were created in this long going compromise that the southern states wanted to make sure they were protecting their economy, which was a slave labor based agricultural economy. And you had issues, the Missouri Compromise, and we're going to talk about some of these things later more in depth, which basically had said that any new state is not going to be a slave state. That went to the Supreme Court. The Dred Scott decision basically said two things. One, Dred Scott was born into a non-slave state, became a slave, was born from slave parents, tried to buy his freedom, and the first people who didn't like that in Missouri, this went to the Supreme Court, and Congress basically said slaves were property, not citizens, and Congress could not ban slavery in new territories. So it overturned that to allow slavery in all of these new territories. And that was a dark day for this country, of course. In 1857, this started to lead to more agitation between the North and South. The South, you had this nullification, and they were big proponents of dual federalism, that the states and federal government are equals, not one over the other. And they started to declare federal laws void between 1860 and 61. This was nullification. If you remember, they talked about John Calhoun from South Carolina. And they basically said, if the people vote to nullify a federal law, then it's nullified. Well, the federal government said, no, not so fast. And when the Northerner, Abraham Lincoln, who was in the new Republican Party at the time, now the Republican Party at the time then and now are very different, as were the Democratic Party then and now. They've changed quite a bit, and we'll discuss that more when we talk about political parties. They've evolved in different directions. So you had the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. It was very deadly, over 600,000 people killed. Then you had the Reconstruction era, where the former Confederates, if you were a former Confederate, you were not allowed to vote and participate in government. So you had all of these Northerners coming down, and then former slaves taking power in political roles. And this irritated the elite power structure in the South, because they were upset to lose slavery, and they were upset that they had lost power. So nullification, dual federalism kind of was destroyed by the Civil War. It's later it was really killed through the New Deal. That was its last gasps. But this really put an end to that. The Reconstruction of the South, they created new state constitutions. They changed a lot of the power structure. You had the three amendments passed, and we're going to talk again a lot more about this later in the semester. And things changed. By 1877, though, the old guard in the South had worked their way back in, and were now allowed to vote, and they took back the power, and many of those changes were slowly over the next decades were reversed, and trying to change back to that, to a more less equal system. So 16th Amendment in 1913, you saw the collection of federal income taxes, which we all suffer now. And the 17th Amendment, we saw the Senate was now allowed to be voted for by the people. And both of these, in essence, limit state power. So those were also ways to limit this dual federalism idea of states and federal at the same level, despite it not explicitly saying otherwise in the Constitution. So what does that mean? 17th Amendment, if the senators now are voted for by the people, then they're not being appointed through the state legislature. So they lose those important, powerful people in the Congress, in the federal national Congress. So now it's up to the people. So that was a big hit for the states. And then, of course, with the income tax, and you had the now lots and lots of money coming to the federal government rather than the states having, comparatively more resources. So federalism and the Marshall Court. And John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1801 to 1935. And he had very many rulings. He was a proponent of federalism and a strong national government. And we saw this in several different cases. And we see that with the McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. And this was the first decision that defined national and state government relationship outside of the Constitution. So this was the first major interpretation, which becomes law as a Supreme Court decision. And it said that Congress may charter a bank, and it's a necessary and proper way to conduct the government business, and that states cannot tax a federal bank because states, the federal government is supreme over the states. So that settled that issue. Gibbons v. Ogden, 1824, you saw Congress's authority under the Commerce Clause disputed. Basically, New York, the state of New York gave one company the authority to control the Hudson River travel. Congress didn't like that, nor did New Jersey and other states. So they said, no, Congress can regulate commercial activity. It's under the Commerce Clause, that's commerce between states, and they couldn't have that monopoly. And so that was destroyed. In Barron v. Baltimore, 1833, the Due Process Clause is guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment and basically said the federal government not at fault for state actions. Cooperative and progressive federalism. So we've changed from dual federalism. Now we're looking at cooperative federalism. And cooperative federalism really came to its height, or it really came to be in the Great Depression. It had started to come to be post-Civil War, but the Great Depression, 1929 through 1930s, when President Roosevelt, FDR, was elected, he created the New Deal, which increased massive amounts of federal programs and grants for the poor, unemployed, for infrastructure, you name it. And this was a massive increase in federal power, but it also was a way to get categorical grants and money, not only to states, but to cities and to counties and other different governmental groups that could apply for these grants or work in partnerships with these New Deal programs. And there was a whole bunch of them. And most of the New Deal programs help build what we now see as this large middle class America. First time home buyers, FHA, you look at Social Security, and the list goes on and on and on. A minimum wage, labor laws, union rights, all of these things were designed to kind of build this large middle class that we grew accustomed to over the last 60, 70, 80 years. In addition, World War II, you're looking at the tail end of the Depression, and then we get into World War II, vastly increased the size of the federal government. Obviously, defense and is part of the federal government, but you saw a need to mobilize and move massive amounts of resources, and so the federal government grew, immensely during that time. And we're going to talk about that more later in the semester. Cooperative federalism. Again, it's a cooperation between federal, state, and local governments in producing government services. Progressive federalism, that's kind of the new version of cooperative federalism. And this is a pragmatic approach to federalism. Pragmatic meaning practical, getting results. If you say someone's a pragmatist or pragmatic, they're going to do what's necessary, the most prudent way to get results. And this views relations between national and state governments as both coercive and cooperative. So the national government can have a coercive relationship. Doesn't mean negative necessarily, but coercive in the sense of incentivized behavior, like a market mechanism to do behavior the federal government deems is beneficial. You also see a major influence in federal grants, and this is going to touch on, we have that movement towards cooperative federalism and later progressive federalism, but there were some other changes. There was a return, what they called new federalism, and it was coined new federalism during the Reagan administration, 1980 through 81 through 89, but it really found a lot of its beginnings under the Nixon administration. Prior to that, in 68 through 74. And this was done through the creation of block grants. So before, in the 60s with LBJ, with President Johnson, you had a lot of these major programs introduced, Medicare, Medicaid, etc. And they were done through categorical grants. And these types of grants are for specific purposes. So basically, a state or a local government or whoever within the state it doesn't have much autonomy or choice in how they're going to spend the money. It's very much defined. This is what you're going to do. Block grants, starting in Nixon and then the Reagan administration pushed for them highly, basically said, we're the federal government isn't going to tell you what to do. We'll give you the money. We're going to have very vague, not vague, but very limited direction. And basically here's the goal. We want to improve education. Here's the money to do it, but we're not going to tell you the 16 steps on how to improve education. So block grants are a lot more open to the states being given discretion over policy. And we saw this as part of de-evolution or decentralization. So the control and nature of government services moves from the federal to the state government. So the federal government since the 70s, but the 80s, and there's still a push. This is a very popular conservative tool in governance is to de-evolution and decentralization, to move that power out of the federal hands and give it to the states. And it also changed in many ways where states replicated what was happening at the federal level, and the states would de-evolve or decentralize to local governments, counties, and NGOs. For example, state hospitals used to be the place where anyone who's an alcoholic, drug addict, depression, all homeless, they were all put into these very large state hospitals, and each county had one, generally, and that's where they'd go, and the state was controlled by the state. And in the 70s, you saw this kind of movement toward closing these large hospitals and just having local county government handle through outpatient or through group homes and things like this, as far as doing that, or just outpatient services, etc. And this was a massive change in how things had been done for the better part of the 20th century. And with that, you also saw the massive increase of number of homeless on the streets and other issues that in the past we would just send them to the state hospital. Not saying that that was a great thing or that they did a fantastic job dealing with these people. There are many cases, horrible, terrible places. But the de-evolution, decentralization was kind of the state didn't want that responsibility anymore. Let's just have the local governments handle it. And in many cases, counties and municipalities, they've decentralized or devolved and given a lot of the actual policy implementation to nonprofits and other groups. So it's continuing. Programmatic requests, these are called earmarks or pork, and these are intended to fund a project that's usually for a specific politician wants to build something in their district so that they get brownie points with the citizens. And many times programmatic requests, the pork or earmarks were used to convince certain politicians to approve something. Like if you approve this bill, we'll give you your bridge, to nowhere or what have you. This has gotten a lot of scrutiny over the years. People don't like it, obviously, because it just helps one area, one town, one politician, and not the public at large. So just to the right, there's a graph there just to give you an idea of how powerful federal grants are to states. If you look at where their revenue comes from, you see that the taxes are about 50%, service charges about 10%, other forms of income about 10%, and then 30% from federal grants. So it really does matter, the federal government to states' operations. It's a massive part of that. Okay, that's it for this week. We're a bit shorter, and I will be setting up the chapter lectures for next week.